She stood in the swirling snow, her breath forming clouds in the bitter February air. 5 boys surrounded her, their laughter cutting through the wind like broken glass. They had taken her jacket, her dignity, her warmth, but they had no idea what they had awakened. This is not a story about revenge. This is about what happens when precision meets desperation, when years of training collide with a moment of truth, and when the quiet girl reveals that some battles are won before the first punch is thrown. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The moving truck pulled away from 847 Maple Street at exactly 7:23 a.m., leaving tire tracks in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Zara Washington watched from her bedroom window as the last piece of her old life disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the gray morning mist of Millbrook, Vermont. The silence that followed felt heavier than the January cold. Seeping through the glass, her mother's voice drifted up from downstairs, muffled by the unfamiliar acoustics of their new home. Phone calls to utility companies, insurance adjustments. The mundane orchestra of relocation that had become the soundtrack to Zara's junior year. This was the 4th move in 3 years. Military families learn to adapt, her father always said, though he wouldn't be saying much of anything anymore. Zara pressed her palm against the frosted window, feeling the cold bite through her skin. Outside, Millbrook stretched before her, like a postcard someone had forgotten to color. White houses with dark shutters, bare maple trees reaching toward an aluminum sky, sidewalks buried under 2 feet of powder that nobody seemed in any hurry to clear. Everything here moved slower, spoke softer, as if the snow had muffled not just sound but urgency itself. She had researched Millbrook Regional High before the move, scrolling through its website with the methodical efficiency she'd inherited from her father. Founded in 1892, enrollment 1,200, mascot the Eagles. Average SAT scores that placed it comfortably in the middle tier of Vermont public schools. What the statistics couldn't tell her was whether this place would finally be different, whether she could slip into its hallways unnoticed and graduate without incident. Her reflection stared back from the window, dark skin that would stand out against Millbrook's overwhelming whiteness, natural hair pulled into a practical bun, brown eyes that had learned to read rooms before entering them. At 17, Zara had developed the ability to assess social dynamics with the same precision her father had once used to analyze terrain. Threat levels, escape routes, potential allies, weaknesses to exploit if necessary. It was not paranoia. It was preparation. The first snowfall had been beautiful from inside their temporary apartment in Colorado Springs. Here, it was a living thing, aggressive and unforgiving. She watched a woman across the street struggle to push a snow shovel. Through the packed drifts, her movements labored and frustrated. Vermont winter was different from the brief, manageable snows she'd known elsewhere. This was a season that demanded respect, planning, and the right equipment. Her phone buzzed. Against the windowsill. A text from her mother, registration at school today. Ready by 8:30? Zara typed back a simple yes and turned away from the window. Her room still smelled like cardboard and packing tape, boxes stacked against unfamiliar walls painted a shade of beige that somehow managed to be both bland and depressing. She'd unpacked only the essentials: clothes, school supplies, and a single framed photograph of her father in dress uniform, his expression serious but proud. The closet held her new reality: heavy wool sweaters, insulated boots, a parka rated for temperatures she'd never imagined experiencing. Vermont demanded a different wardrobe, a different pace, a different version of herself. She selected dark jeans, a gray thermal shirt, and the winter boots her mother had insisted on buying despite their cost. Everything practical, everything designed to blend in. Millbrook Regional High rose from the landscape like a brick fortress, Its 3 stories crowned with snow and surrounded by parking lots that had been carved into the frozen earth through sheer determination. Yellow buses discharged their cargo of bundled teenagers who moved across the white expanse with the casual confidence of people who had never known winter as anything but routine. Zara walked beside her mother toward the main entrance, her boots crunching through snow that squeaked with each step. The administrative offices smelled like industrial coffee and wet wool, a combination that would forever remind her of this morning. Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, guidance counselor, spread Zara's transcripts across her desk like she was reading tea leaves. Her smile was professional but genuine, the kind that came from 2 decades of helping nervous transfer students navigate new beginnings. Excellent grades, Mrs. Hendricks noted, her finger tracing down the columns of A's that Zara had maintained through 3 different schools. AP courses honor roll, community service hours. You'll fit right in with our college prep track. She looked up, her gray eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. Moving during junior year is never easy, but you seem well prepared academically. Zara's mother squeezed her shoulder. She's always been focused. Even with all the moving around, she's managed to stay on track. There was pride in her voice, but underneath it, Zara heard the exhaustion that came from rebuilding their lives every 18 months. The schedule Mrs. Hendricks handed her was color-coded and efficient. AP literature, calculus, chemistry, European history, French 3, and physical education. Standard junior year coursework that would transfer cleanly to whatever college would eventually accept her applications. She memorized the room numbers and teacher names while Mrs. Hendricks explained the building layout, lunch periods, and the importance of snow day protocols. One more thing, Mrs. Hendricks said, reaching into her desk drawer. We have an excellent peer mentoring program. I'd like to assign you to someone who can help you navigate those first few weeks. She pulled out a folder marked with the school logo. Sarah Chun is one of our strongest students, very involved, and knows everyone. I think you'd get along well. Zara accepted the folder with a polite nod, though she had no intention of needing a mentor. She'd perfected the art of academic invisibility, maintaining high grades while avoiding the social complexities that came with friendship. It was safer that way, cleaner. Relationships required trust, and trust required staying in one place long enough to build it. The tour that followed revealed a school caught between era's original brick hallways lined with modern lockers, updated computer labs next to classrooms that still had chalkboards, a gymnasium that echoed with decades of cheering crowds and broken dreams. Students moved through the corridors with the easy familiarity of people who had grown up together, their conversations flowing around inside jokes and shared memories that stretched back to elementary school. Zara watched them from the edges, cataloging details. The athletic students clustered near the trophy cases, their movements confident and territorial. The academic achievers gathered around bulletin boards, advertising college fairs and scholarship opportunities. The artists claimed the space near the music and drama rooms, their clothing more colorful, their voices more animated. Everyone had found their place in the ecosystem. She said goodbye to her mother in the parking lot, watching the familiar blue Honda disappear into traffic that moved at Vermont's unhurried pace. Her first class wouldn't start for another 20 minutes, time enough to locate her locker and begin the careful process of mapping social territories. The hallways were warming up now, filled with the noise of teenagers shedding winter coats and comparing weekend stories. Her locker was located in the junior hall, third row from the windows that looked out over snow-covered athletic fields. The combination worked on the first try. 17-23-9, her father's birthday. She hung her parka carefully, noting how the other students decorated their spaces with photographs, mirrors, and the accumulated debris of high school life. Hers would remain functional, anonymous. You must be the new girl. The voice belonged to a petite Asian girl with short black hair and a smile that seemed genuinely warm. I'm Sarah Chun. Mrs. Hendricks asked me to look out for you. She extended her hand with old-fashioned courtesy. Welcome to Millbrook. Zara shook the offered hand, measuring the grip firm but not aggressive, confident without being pushy. Zara Washington. Thank you for the welcome. She kept her voice neutral, polite but not encouraging. First impressions mattered, but so did maintaining distance. Sarah either didn't notice the coolness or chose to ignore it. I grabbed your schedule from the office. We have European history together in the third period, and I think chemistry fourth. Want me to walk you to the first period? A P-Lit with Mr. Davidson can be a little intimidating if you don't know what to expect. The offer was practical, and Zara had learned to accept help when it served her purposes. That would be helpful. She gathered her books, noting how Sarah moved through the hallways greeting classmates with easy familiarity, but never lingering long enough to get caught in extended conversations. She was socially connected but academically focused, a combination that had probably made her an ideal choice for peer mentoring. Mr. Davidson's classroom occupied a corner of the second floor, its windows offering a view of the parking lot and the mountains beyond. The walls were lined with literary quotes and posters advertising college summer programs, the aesthetic of someone who took both education and inspiration seriously. Students filed in with the sluggish energy of first period, settling into desks arranged in a rough semicircle that encouraged discussion. Zara chose a seat 3 rows back, close enough to participate when called upon, but far enough from the front to avoid unwanted attention. Sarah sat 2 seats over, offering a small wave before turning her attention to her notebook. The other students seemed barely aware of the new addition to their class, their focus already shifting to the day's lesson. Mr. Davidson entered precisely as the bell rang, a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of intensity that suggested he'd rather be discussing literature than managing teenagers. He wrote the day's agenda on the whiteboard in neat, precise letters: character analysis, motivation versus action in Macbeth, Act 3. Today we're examining the moment when Macbeth's ambition transforms from internal struggle to external violence, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who genuinely loved his subject. I want you to consider how Shakespeare reveals character through the gap between what people want and what they're willing to do to get it. The discussion that followed was more sophisticated than Zara had expected from a rural Vermont high school. Students engaged with the text thoughtfully, building on each other's observations about power, corruption, and the psychology of violence. She listened carefully, noting the dynamics of intellectual leadership: who spoke first, who waited to see which way the conversation would develop. When Mr. Davidson called on her directly, Miss Washington, what's your take on Lady Macbeth's influence in this scene? She was ready with an answer that demonstrated both preparation and original thinking. I think Shakespeare is showing us that manipulation works best when it appeals to what the victim already wants. Lady Macbeth doesn't create Macbeth's ambition, she just gives him permission to act on it. The response earned approving nods from several classmates and a satisfied expression from Mr. Davidson. Excellent observation. The idea of permission is crucial to understanding how influence operates. He moved the discussion forward, but Zara had established herself as someone who belonged in the academic conversation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning progressed through calculus and chemistry with similar efficiency. Teachers who knew their subjects, students who ranged from engaged to indifferent, but generally respectful of the learning environment. Sarah proved to be a reliable guide, offering navigation tips without being intrusive, introducing her to other students without creating social obligations. It was during the transition to fourth period that Zara first noticed him. Connor Blake stood near the main stairwell, surrounded by a group of boys who seemed to orbit around his presence like planets around the sun. Tall, athletic, with the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. He wore his leather jacket like armor and spoke with the assumption that everyone within earshot was interested in his opinions. "Did you see Martinez try to guard me in practice yesterday?" he was saying, his voice carrying across the hallway. Dude looked like he was moving through water. "The coach says I'm getting looks from UVM scouts." His audience responded with the appropriate laughter and encouragement, feeding the narrative of inevitable success that seemed to surround him. Zara recognized the type, the student who had never learned the difference between confidence and entitlement, who confused being noticed with being important. Sarah noticed her watching. "Connor Blake," she said quietly as they walked past. "Starting forward on the basketball team, class president, generally considered untouchable around here." There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with that untouchability. "Meaning?" Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Meaning his father owns half the commercial real estate in town, and his mother chairs the school board. Meaning he's been the golden boy since elementary school, and nobody's ever successfully called him out on anything." Sarah's voice remained carefully neutral, but her eyes held a warning. "He's not necessarily a bad guy, but he's not used to hearing the word no." They continued toward chemistry, but Zara filed the information away with the same methodical care she applied to everything else. Every school had its power structure, its untouchables, its students who operated by different rules. The key was understanding those structures without getting caught up in them, navigating around the obstacles rather than challenging them directly. She had no intention of challenging Connor Blake or anyone else. She was here to graduate, to maintain the academic trajectory that would carry her to college and beyond. Everything else was background noise, temporary complications in a temporary situation. But as she settled into her chemistry seat and began copying notes about molecular bonding, she couldn't shake the memory of Connor's voice, carrying across the hallway with absolute certainty that the world would continue to arrange itself for his convenience. Some certainties, she knew from experience, were more fragile than they appeared. The cafeteria at Millbrook Regional buzzed with the controlled chaos of 400 teenagers trying to eat, socialize, and establish dominance all within a 30-minute window. Zara stood at the entrance, tray in hand, scanning the landscape of circular tables and long benches like a strategist surveying a battlefield. The smell of institutional pizza and industrial-strength disinfectant hung in the air, occasionally punctuated by bursts of laughter or the scrape of metal chairs against linoleum. She had studied this ecosystem for 3 days now, mapping the invisible boundaries that divided the space. Athletes claimed the tables near the windows, their leather jackets creating a visual barrier between themselves and the rest of the student body. Honor students gathered around the tables closest to the library entrance, textbooks and calculators, sharing space with lunch trays. The art students occupied the far corner, their conversations animated with gestures that seemed to paint pictures in the air. Sarah waved from a table in the neutral zone, the social equivalent of Switzerland, where different groups could coexist without territorial disputes. Zara made her way through the maze of backpacks and conversations, noting how students shifted slightly to accommodate her passage, polite but distant, acknowledging her presence without inviting interaction. "How's the adjustment going?" Sarah asked as Zara settled into her seat. Around them, 5 other students continued their discussion about the upcoming winter formal, their voices blending into the background hum of adolescent concerns. "Academically fine," Zara replied, unwrapping her sandwich with methodical precision. "Teachers seem competent, coursework is manageable." She left unsaid the social calculations that occupied more of her mental energy than any homework assignment. Marcus Rodriguez, a quiet sophomore with thick-rimmed glasses and paint-stained fingers, looked up from his sketchbook. "You're from Colorado, right? How do you handle the snow here?" "It's different from mountain snow." It was an observation that showed more awareness than most of her classmates had demonstrated. "It's heavier," Zara acknowledged. "More persistent. Mountain snow comes and goes. This feels like it plans to stay until spring decides otherwise." The comment earned a few chuckles from the table, the kind of mild approval that came from making an accurate observation about shared experience. But before the conversation could develop, a shadow fell across their table. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" Connor Blake didn't wait for permission before sliding into the empty chair across from Zara. Up close, she could see that his confidence wasn't entirely superficial. He had the kind of athletic build that came from years of dedicated training. And his eyes held an intelligence that his public persona sometimes obscured. The table's dynamic shifted instantly. Conversations quieted. Attention focused, as if a celebrity had decided to grace their presence. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Zara caught the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around her water bottle. "Zara, right?" Connor's smile was practiced but not entirely artificial. "I heard you transferred from Colorado Springs. Military family?" The question was casual, but Zara recognized the probing quality underneath. He was fishing for information, trying to establish the parameters of her background. She said simply. "My father's deployment ended." It was technically true, though "ended" was a euphemism that covered more grief than she intended to share with someone she'd known for less than a week. Connor nodded with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that suggested familiarity with military culture, though whether from personal experience or social coaching was unclear. "Tough transition," he said. "Moving junior year, new climate, different social dynamics. If you need anything, introductions, local knowledge, help navigating the system, just let me know. I've been here since kindergarten, and I know pretty much everyone." The offer sounded genuine, but Zara had learned to recognize power plays disguised as generosity. Connor wasn't being kind. He was establishing himself as a resource, positioning himself as someone she might owe favors to later. It was a sophisticated approach, more subtle than outright intimidation. "I appreciate that," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Sarah's been helpful with the basics. I'm sure I'll figure out the rest." Something flickered across Connor's expression: surprise, perhaps, or mild irritation at having his offer politely deflected. Students at Millbrook probably didn't often decline his assistance. He recovered quickly, his smile returning to its practiced warmth. "Of course, just wanted to make sure you felt welcome." He stood, placing his hand briefly on the back of her chair in a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and territorial. "See you around." After he left, the table remained quiet for several beats, as if everyone was processing what they'd witnessed. Finally, Marcus broke the silence with characteristic directness. "That was interesting," he said, returning to his sketch. "Connor doesn't usually introduce himself to new students personally." "Meaning?" Zara asked, though she suspected she already understood. Sarah twisted her water bottle cap with deliberate precision. "Meaning he's curious about you, which could be good or problematic, depending on how you handle it." The warning was subtle but clear. Zara filed it away with her growing collection of observations about Millbrook's social ecosystem. Every environment had its apex predators, and Connor Blake clearly occupied that position here. The question was whether he saw her as potential prey or something more complex. The afternoon brought physics with Dr. Elizabeth Carver, a former MIT researcher who had retired to Vermont and taken up teaching as what she called intellectual community service. Her classroom was a testament to scientific curiosity: circuit boards mounted on the walls, a Tesla coil in one corner, and a periodic table that she'd hand-painted with annotations about electron behavior. "Today we're exploring momentum and collision theory," Dr. Carver announced, her white hair pulled back in a bun secured with what appeared to be a pencil. Who can tell me what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object? The class fell silent, intimidated either by the question's philosophical implications or Dr. Carver's reputation for intellectual rigor. Zara raised her hand slowly. "The question itself is flawed," she said when called upon. "If a force is truly irresistible, then by definition, no object can be immovable. The terms are mutually exclusive." Dr. Carver's eyes lit up with approval. "Exactly. The paradox exists. Only in language, not in physics. In reality, every collision involves two objects with finite mass and momentum. The outcome depends on the variables involved: mass, velocity, angle of contact, material properties." She moved to the whiteboard, writing equations with the fluid motion of someone who had spent decades translating complex concepts into teachable moments. This is why understanding the physics of interaction is crucial. Whether we're talking about particles, planets, or people, the same principles apply. The lesson that followed was more engaging than Zara had expected from a rural high school physics class. Dr. Carver had a gift for making abstract concepts concrete, using examples that ranged from car crashes to asteroid impacts to explain how force, mass, and velocity determined the outcome of any collision. "For homework," Dr. Carver announced as the bell approached, "I want you to identify a real-world collision scenario and analyze it using the principles we've discussed today. Could be sports, traffic accidents, even social interactions. Physics is everywhere once you learn to see it." As students filed out, Dr. Carver called Zara back. "Ms. Washington, could I speak with you for a moment?" Zara approached the teacher's desk, noting the collection of scientific journals and university correspondence that suggested Dr. Carver maintained connections to the academic world beyond Millbrook's borders. "Your answer today showed sophisticated thinking," Dr. Carver said, removing her glasses to clean them with a cloth that had seen better days. "Have you considered pursuing physics or engineering in college?" "I've thought about it," Zara replied honestly, "but I'm still exploring options." Dr. Carver nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you decide you're interested in exploring further, I run an independent study program for advanced students. We work on actual research projects, occasionally collaborate with universities. It's demanding work, but rewarding for students who enjoy intellectual challenges." The offer was unexpected but intriguing. "What kind of research?" "This year we're studying impact dynamics in extreme weather conditions. How different materials respond to stress under varying temperatures. Humidity levels, that sort of thing. Practical applications for everything from building design to sports equipment." Dr. Carver's expression suggested she was offering more than just extra credit. "Think about it. No pressure, but the opportunity is there if you're interested." Zara thanked her and gathered her books, but the conversation stayed with her as she navigated the halls toward her final class of the day. Physical education with Coach Amanda Torres promised to be the most challenging part of her schedule, not because of academic rigor, but because of the social dynamics involved. The girls' locker room smelled like industrial soap and adolescent anxiety, a combination that seemed universal regardless of geography. Zara changed into her regulation gym clothes, gray shorts, and a blue t-shirt with the Millbrook Eagles logo while listening to the conversations that swirled around her. "Did you see what Madison wore to lunch? That sweater probably cost more than my car payment," someone was saying from behind a row of lockers. "Connor asked Jessica for the winter formal yesterday. Third girl this week." "He's definitely keeping his options open," another voice added, followed by giggles that suggested this was considered scandalous rather than concerning. Zara laced her sneakers and tried to ignore the familiar dance of teenage social politics. Every school had the same conversations, the same hierarchies, the same preoccupation with who was dating whom and who could afford what. The details changed, but the underlying patterns remained constant. Coach Torres gathered the class in the gymnasium, a cavernous space that echoed with the sound of sneakers on polished wood. She was younger than most of the faculty, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of compact athleticism that suggested she could still outperform most of her students in whatever sport they chose. "Today we're starting our winter unit on defensive strategies," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the gym. "We'll be covering situational awareness, personal safety, and basic self-defense techniques. This isn't about teaching you to fight, it's about teaching you to think clearly under pressure." The class was divided into pairs for a basic exercise in spatial awareness. Students were instructed to walk slowly around the gym while their partners tried to approach from behind without being detected. The goal was to develop peripheral vision and an intuitive sense of personal space. Zara was paired with Jessica Montgomery, a petite blonde who seemed more concerned with maintaining her hairstyle than engaging with the lesson. "This is so weird," Jessica whispered as they took their positions. "When am I ever going to need to know if someone's sneaking up on me?" The question revealed a kind of innocence that Zara envied. Jessica had apparently lived her entire life without considering that the world might contain threats worth preparing for. It was a luxury that came from growing up in places like Millbrook, where the biggest dangers were social embarrassment and college rejection letters. When it was Zara's turn to detect approach, she found the exercise almost insultingly simple. Years of moving through military bases had taught her to maintain constant awareness of her surroundings. She could sense Jessica's position even when the other girl was trying to move silently, could feel the subtle changes in air pressure and ambient sound that announced someone's presence. "How did you know I was there?" Jessica asked after her fourth failed attempt at stealth approach. "I was being super quiet." "Breathing," Zara replied simply, "and your perfume. Scent carries farther than people think." Coach Torres had been watching their exercise with increasing interest. When the class ended, she approached Zara with the same thoughtful expression Dr. Carver had worn earlier. "You've had training," she observed. It wasn't a question. Zara considered her response carefully. Some background in situational awareness. "Military." "Family?" Coach Torres asked, echoing Connor's earlier question. "Yes." Coach Torres nodded as if this explained something that had been puzzling her. "I teach a more advanced self-defense class after school, Tuesdays and Thursdays. We work on practical techniques, real-world scenarios. If you're interested, you'd be welcome to join." It was the second extracurricular invitation Zara had received in one day, both from teachers who seemed to recognize something in her that went beyond standard academic achievement. She was still formulating a response when the dismissal bell rang, ending both the conversation and her first full day at Millbrook Regional. As she gathered her belongings from her locker, Zara reflected on the subtle currents she'd observed flowing beneath the school's surface. Connor Blake's calculated friendliness, Sarah's careful warnings, Dr. Carver's research opportunities, Coach Torres's advanced training. Each interaction had revealed layers of complexity that the school's official presentation didn't acknowledge. She stepped outside into the late afternoon cold, watching students disperse toward buses, cars, and the few who lived close enough to walk home through the snow-covered streets. The winter air bit at her exposed skin, reminding her that she was still adapting to this environment in ways both obvious and subtle. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new calculations, new opportunities to understand the ecosystem she was now part of. She had no intention of becoming deeply involved in Millbrook's social complexities, but she was beginning to realize that involvement might not be entirely optional. Some currents, she was learning, were stronger than individual choice. The first test came disguised as an accident. Zara was standing at her locker Thursday morning, organizing her textbooks with the methodical precision that had become her trademark, when someone crashed into her from behind, hard, her books scattered across the hallway floor, pages fluttering like wounded birds as students stepped around the debris with practiced indifference. "Oh man, sorry about that." The voice belonged to Derek Hoffman, Connor's closest friend and starting center on the basketball team. He was massive, 6'5" and built like a wall, but his expression of concern seemed genuine as he bent to help gather her scattered materials. "Didn't see you there. These halls get crazy between periods." Zara studied his face as she retrieved her calculus textbook, noting the slight tension around his eyes that suggested this collision hadn't been quite as accidental as he claimed. But his hands were steady as he handed her papers back, and his apology sounded sincere enough that she couldn't call him out without seeming paranoid. "No problem," she said, accepting her notebook from him. "Happens to everyone." Derek nodded and moved on, but not before she caught the subtle glance he threw toward Connor's usual position near the trophy cases. The message was clear: mission accomplished. They were testing her reactions, seeing how she handled unexpected physical contact, whether she'd respond with aggression or absorb the impact without retaliation. She chose absorption, but filed the incident away as intelligence rather than random mishap. The games were beginning. During European history, she noticed Connor watching her with new attention. Not obvious staring, but the kind of peripheral monitoring that suggested active assessment. When Mr. Brennan asked for analysis of Napoleon's Russian campaign, Connor waited until Zara had finished her response before offering his own perspective, one that built on her points while subtly undermining her conclusions. "Zara makes a good point about logistics," he said, his tone respectful but patronizing. "But I think she's overlooking the psychological factor. Napoleon wasn't just fighting the Russian army, he was fighting Russian winter and Russian resolve. Sometimes environmental factors matter more than strategic planning." It was smoothly done, acknowledging her intelligence while suggesting she'd missed something obvious. A few students nodded along with his analysis, and Mr. Brennan seemed pleased with the intellectual exchange. Zara let it pass without comment, but she understood the subtext. Connor was establishing himself as the more insightful analyst, the local authority on complex subjects. The pattern continued through chemistry, where Connor happened to be Zara's lab partner for the day's experiment on reaction rates. He was competent enough at technical work, but he dominated the discussion of results, explaining concepts she already understood as if she were struggling to keep up. "The key thing to remember," he said while recording their data, "is that temperature affects molecular movement. In a place like this, where winter lasts 6 months, you really see how the environment shapes everything." He smiled as if sharing local wisdom with an outsider. "It takes time to adapt to how things work here." Dr. Martinez, the chemistry teacher, praised their teamwork when they submitted their lab report, apparently missing the dynamic playing out between her students. But Zara caught the satisfied expression that flickered across Connor's face. He was enjoying the performance, the careful demonstration of his superiority disguised as helpfulness. Lunch brought a different kind of pressure. Instead of joining Sarah at their usual table, Zara found herself invited to sit with Connor's extended circle athletes, student government members, and what appeared to be the social aristocracy of Millbrook Regional. The invitation came through Jessica Montgomery, who approached with the breathless excitement of someone delivering important news. "Connor said you should sit with us today," Jessica announced, as if this were an honor rather than a command. "We were just talking about winter formal planning, and he thought you might want to get involved. You know, help you meet people, get connected." The invitation was phrased as inclusion, but Zara recognized it as interrogation. She was being summoned for closer examination, brought into their territory where they could study her responses. Under social pressure, she accepted with polite enthusiasm, following Jessica to the prime real estate near the windows where Connor held court. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in subtle dominance. Connor didn't exclude her from discussions, but he controlled the topics. steering them toward local references and shared experiences that highlighted her outsider status. Stories about middle school teachers she'd never met, jokes about town, politics she couldn't understand, reminiscences about events that had happened before her arrival. "Remember when Coach Patterson made us run sprints in this snow freshman year?" Derek was saying, his voice warm with nostalgia. "Half the team threw up in the parking lot." "That was nothing compared to the hazing ritual at basketball camp," added Tyler Vance, another member of Connor's inner circle. 3 days in the mountains with no heat, no real food. Builds character, though. You learn who can handle pressure and who can't. The stories weren't directed at her, but they served a clear purpose, establishing bonds she couldn't share, demonstrating the depth of relationship she couldn't match. She was the audience, not the participant, observing traditions and connections. That stretched back years. When they did include her, it was with questions designed to probe for weaknesses. Where exactly in Colorado had she lived? What had her father done in the military? Why had they moved to Vermont specifically? Each query sounded like polite interest, but Zara recognized the intelligence-gathering operation underneath. Military. "Brats usually have interesting stories," Connor said, leaning back in his chair with casual authority. "All that moving around, different bases, different schools. It must be tough never putting down roots." There was sympathy in his voice, but also a subtle assertion of his own stability, his deep connections to this place and these people. He belonged here in ways she never could, and he wanted her to understand that distinction. "It has advantages," Zara replied carefully. "You learn to adapt quickly, read new situations, find your footing without depending on existing relationships." "Sure." Connor nodded, but his smile suggested he found her response naive. "Though there's something to be said for the kind of trust that comes from knowing people your whole life. When things get difficult, you want people around you who understand your history, who'll have your back no matter what." The comment landed with uncomfortable precision. Here was Connor, surrounded by friends who'd known him since childhood, speaking to someone who'd been in town less than 2 weeks. The power imbalance was obvious, and he was making sure she felt it. The interrogation might have continued, but it was interrupted by an announcement over the PA system. "Attention students, due to weather conditions, all after-school activities are canceled today. Buses will run on an early schedule. Please check with your teachers for any assignment modifications." Through the cafeteria windows, Zara could see what had prompted the announcement. Snow was falling heavily now, fat flakes that accumulated rapidly on cars and walkways. The storm that weather reports had been predicting for days was finally arriving, and it looked serious. "Nor'easter," Connor said, following her gaze. "City folks always underestimate these. Could dump 2 feet before it's done." He stood, gathering his belongings with practiced efficiency. "Hope you've got good boots and know how to drive in snow." Vermont winters separate the prepared from the pretenders pretty quickly. The dismissal was polite but clear. Lunch was over, and so was her temporary inclusion in his circle. She'd been examined, cataloged, and filed away for future reference. As she returned to Sarah's table, she felt the weight of those assessments following her like shadows. Sarah looked up from her textbook with concern. "How did that go?" "Educational," Zara replied, unwrapping her sandwich with deliberate calm. Around them, the cafeteria buzzed with excitement about the approaching storm plans being canceled, rides being arranged, the particular energy that came with weather dramatic enough to disrupt routine. Connor's not usually so attentive to new students, Sarah observed carefully, especially ones who don't immediately join his fan club. It was another gentle warning, but Zara was beginning to understand that Sarah's caution came from personal experience rather than general paranoia. There was history here, dynamics that stretched back years and ran deeper than high school social politics. The afternoon brought early dismissal as the storm intensified. By the time Zara reached her locker, Snow was falling so heavily that visibility in the parking lot had dropped to maybe 50 feet. Students moved with the hurried efficiency of people who understood what serious weather could do. Conversations focused on logistics, rather than social drama. She was pulling on her winter coat when she noticed Connor and his friends gathered near the main entrance, their voices low but their body language tense. They weren't discussing ride arrangements or homework modifications. This was something else, something that involved frequent glances in her direction. As she approached the doors, Connor intercepted her with what appeared to be casual timing. "Hey, how are you getting home?" he asked, his concern seeming genuine. "This is turning into a real storm. If you need a ride, I've got four-wheel drive." The offer sounded helpful, but Zara had learned to recognize tactical positioning. Connor was placing himself in the role of protector, someone she might owe gratitude to later. It was the same pattern from lunch-apparent kindness that created subtle obligations. "I'm fine," she replied, pulling her hood up against the wind that was beginning to howl through the open doors. "My mom's picking me up." Connor nodded, but she caught the flicker of irritation that crossed his expression. He wasn't used to having his offers declined, especially by someone who supposedly needed his help. "Sure, but if plans change, just let me know. Wouldn't want you getting stuck in this." She thanked him and stepped out into the storm, feeling the cold immediately bite through her jacket. The snow was coming down harder now, driven by wind that turned each flake into a tiny projectile. Her mother's car was already waiting in the pickup lane, headlights cutting through the white chaos. As she climbed into the passenger seat, Zara glanced back at the school entrance. Connor and his friends were still there, watching her departure with expressions she couldn't quite read through the swirling snow. But their attention felt different now, less casual, more purposeful. "How was school?" her mother asked, turning up the heat as they pulled into traffic that moved at a crawl through the accumulating snow. "Interesting," Zara replied, watching the familiar buildings of downtown Millbrook disappear behind the white curtain of the storm. "I think I'm starting to understand how things work here." Her mother nodded, concentrating on the treacherous road conditions. But as they drove through the mounting storm, Zara found herself thinking about pressure, how it built gradually, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly the environment became dangerous for anyone who wasn't prepared. The weather outside was only one kind of storm. Inside Millbrook Regional, another kind of pressure was building, and she was beginning to suspect that Connor Blake was testing more than just her social adaptability. Some tests, she knew from experience, were designed to find breaking points. The question was whether he understood what he was really testing for. The storm raged for 3 days, transforming Millbrook into a white fortress cut off from the outside world. Schools remained closed, roads became impassable, and the town settled into the peculiar isolation that came with serious Vermont weather. From her bedroom window, Zara watched snow pile against houses until first floors disappeared. Cars became abstract sculptures, and the familiar landscape turned alien. When classes finally resumed on Monday, the social atmosphere had shifted in ways that became apparent within the first hour. Students who had been friendly before now offered polite but distant smiles. Conversation stopped when she approached, then resumed in lowered voices after she passed. The subtle exclusion was professionally executed, nothing obvious enough to complain about, but unmistakable in its consistency. Sarah confirmed what Zara had already intuited during their brief encounter at her locker. "Something happened over the weekend," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hallway noise. "I'm not sure what, but Connor's been spreading some kind of story. People are cautious around you now." The warning came too late. During first period P literature, when Mr. Davidson asked for volunteers to present analysis of the weekend's reading assignment, no hands went up. Usually, several students competed for the opportunity to demonstrate their insights. Today, The classroom sat in uncomfortable silence until Mr. Davidson had to directly assign the presentation to a reluctant volunteer. In physics, Dr. Carver's offer of independent study was quietly retracted. "I've been thinking about the research project," she said after class, avoiding direct eye contact. "Perhaps it would be better to wait until next semester to give you more time to settle in." Her tone was apologetic but firm, the voice of someone who had received instructions from above. The pattern continued through chemistry, where her usual lab partners suddenly had other arrangements, and European history, where Connor delivered a presentation on psychological warfare that seemed specifically designed for her benefit. He discussed tactics used by occupying forces to isolate resistance members, cutting them off from local support, spreading doubt about their intentions, making them appear dangerous to the community they were trying to protect. "The most effective approach," Connor explained to the class, his voice carrying academic authority, "is to make the target appear unstable or threatening without direct confrontation. Let social pressure do the work. Eventually, the person either conforms or removes themselves from the environment." Mr. Brennan praised the presentation for its historical insight, apparently missing the contemporary application playing out in his classroom. But Zara understood she was listening to a strategic briefing disguised as a history lesson. Connor was explaining his methodology while demonstrating its effectiveness. Lunch provided the clearest evidence of how thoroughly the isolation campaign had succeeded. The neutral zone where Sarah's group usually sat was now decidedly unwelcoming. When Zara approached with her tray, conversations faltered, and several students found urgent reasons to leave early. Even Marcus, the quiet artist who had seemed immune to social politics, avoided eye contact as he packed up his sketchbook. Sarah remained, but her discomfort was obvious. "I'm sorry," she said as they sat alone at what had been a full table just days before. "People are scared. There are rumors about your background, about why your family really moved here. Connor's suggesting you might be dangerous." "What kind of danger?" Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the direction of the narrative. "Military training, anger management issues, a history of violence at your previous school." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's not saying these things directly, he's too smart for that. But he's asking questions that plant seeds. Do you think it's normal for someone to be so calm all the time? Has anyone noticed she never talks about her past? That kind of thing." It was elegantly done, Zara had to admit. Connor was using her strengths against her. The composure that came from self-discipline became evidence of hidden instability. The privacy that came from frequent moves became proof of shameful secrets. He was reframing her character through a lens of suspicion, encouraging others to reinterpret everything they'd observed about her. The afternoon brought a summons to the guidance office. Mrs. Hendricks wore the expression of someone delivering unwelcome news as she gestured for Zara to take a seat across from her desk. The office felt smaller than before, more institutional, as if the warm welcome atmosphere had been deliberately removed. "I've received some concerns," Mrs. Hendricks began carefully, "about your adjustment to our school environment. Nothing specific, just observations from teachers and students who feel there might be some underlying tensions." Zara waited for specifics, but none came. Instead, Mrs. Hendricks launched into a prepared speech about the importance of open communication, conflict resolution, and the counseling resources available to students experiencing difficulty with social integration. The message was clear. She was being labeled as the problem that needed to be managed. "Are there specific incidents you'd like to discuss?" Zara asked when Mrs. Hendricks paused for her response. "Not incidents, exactly," the counselor replied, shuffling papers that didn't seem to contain any actual documentation. "More like patterns of behavior that suggest you might be struggling with the transition more than you're willing to admit." Sometimes students who move frequently develop defensive mechanisms that can appear hostile to others. The psychological assessment was delivered with professional kindness, but Zara recognized the trap being constructed around her. She was being pathologized, her competence reframed as defensiveness, her independence interpreted as inability to connect, her self-control seen as evidence of suppressed aggression. "I understand the concern," Zara replied carefully, "but I haven't experienced any difficulties with other students. My academic performance has been consistent, and I followed all school policies." Mrs. Hendricks nodded with the patience of someone who had expected denial. "Of course, and no one is suggesting otherwise. But sometimes our own perceptions don't match how others experience our behavior. It might be helpful to examine whether your approach to social interaction is sending unintended messages." The session continued for another 20 minutes with Mrs. Hendricks suggesting anger management counseling, social skills coaching, and regular check-ins to monitor Zara's adjustment progress. Each recommendation was framed as supportive intervention, but the cumulative effect was to establish an official record of concern about her psychological state. When she finally left the guidance office, Zara felt the weight of institutional momentum building against her. Connor hadn't just isolated her socially, he'd begun the process of creating an official narrative that would justify whatever escalation he had planned. If she defended herself against future aggression, the documentation would already exist. To frame her as the unstable aggressor, the final blow came during pay, where Coach Torres approached her with obvious reluctance. "I need to talk to you about the advanced self-defense class," she said, her voice strained with conflicting loyalties. "Given some recent concerns about student safety, I think it would be better if you focused on the regular curriculum for now." The withdrawal of the training opportunity felt like the removal of the last tool she might have used to prepare for what was coming. But more than that, it represented the complete success of Connor's campaign. Even adults who had recognized her capabilities were now viewing her as a potential threat rather than a promising student. That evening, as she sat in her bedroom watching snow fall again outside her window, Zara finally allowed herself to acknowledge the reality of her situation. The careful neutrality she had maintained, the strategic invisibility she had cultivated, had failed to protect her from becoming a target. Connor Blake had identified her as a challenge to his dominance and had systematically dismantled her position within the school's social structure. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Some people don't know when they're not wanted. Smart people figure it out before things get unpleasant." The message wasn't signed, but the sender was obvious. Connor was moving to the final phase of his campaign, transitioning from social pressure to direct intimidation. The psychological warfare was ending. Something more concrete was about to begin. Zara deleted the message without responding, but she understood its significance. The isolation phase was complete. She had been cut off from all eyes, labeled as unstable by authority figures, and positioned as the aggressor in any future conflict. Connor had done everything possible to ensure that when physical confrontation finally came, she would be alone and without institutional support. As she prepared for bed, Zara found herself thinking about her father's lessons on tactical analysis. When an enemy controls the battlefield, he had taught her, you have two choices: retreat or change the nature of the engagement. Sometimes survival means refusing to fight the battle they want you to fight. But retreat wasn't an option, not when it meant abandoning her education, her future, her mother's hopes for stability. And changing the nature of the engagement required resources she no longer had access to. She turned off the lights and lay in darkness, listening to wind howl around the house with increasing intensity. Another storm was building outside, and she suspected that when it reached its peak, Connor Blake would finally make his move. The isolation was complete. The stage was set. All that remained was the final act of a drama that had been carefully orchestrated from the beginning. Some battles, she was learning, were designed to be unwinnable, except for those who understood that the real fight wasn't about winning or losing, but about survival and what you were willing to become in order to endure. The second storm arrived on Friday afternoon with meteorological precision, as if nature itself had been coordinating with Connor Blake's timeline. By 2 p.m., snow was falling so heavily that the administration made the decision to dismiss school early, sending students scrambling for rides and rearranging weekend plans that suddenly seemed optimistic. Zara stood at her locker, methodically packing her weekend homework, while around her the hallways buzzed with storm-related excitement. Conversations focused on canceled plans, early dismissals, and the particular energy that came with weather dramatic enough to disrupt the established order. She had learned to navigate these moments with careful invisibility, neither rushing nor lingering, avoiding the clusters of students who might suddenly remember she existed. Her mother had texted 20 minutes earlier, delayed at work, would pick her up by 3:30 if the roads remained passable. That left Zara with nearly an hour to wait while the building gradually emptied around her. Most students had already departed, collected by parents anxious to beat the worst of the storm or catching buses that ran on accelerated schedules. She decided to wait in the library, the one place that remained neutral territory, even under the current social conditions. Mrs. Patricia Coleman, the librarian, had maintained professional courtesy throughout the week's isolation campaign, offering neither friendship nor hostility, simply the impersonal assistance that came with her institutional role. The library felt different with most students gone. Larger, quieter, filled with the particular silence that belonged to spaces designed for contemplation. Zara settled into a corner table between the science and mathematics sections, spreading her calculus homework across the wooden surface while snow continued to accumulate against the tall windows. She had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when she became aware of voices in the main corridor, too distant to understand, but carrying the particular cadence that suggested planning rather than casual conversation. The voices moved closer, accompanied by footsteps that seemed deliberately measured, purposeful. Through the library's glass doors, she caught glimpses of movement, figures passing back and forth in front of the entrance, as if establishing positions. Her peripheral awareness, honed by years of frequent relocation and the constant need to assess new environments, registered the change in ambient activity even as she continued working through calculus problems. The voices stopped. The footsteps quieted. The hallway outside fell into a silence that felt different from the natural emptiness of an evacuated building. Zara set down her pencil and listened. The storm outside provided a constant background of white noise whined against windows, building's heating system working harder than usual, the subtle creaks and settling sounds that came with changing atmospheric pressure. But underneath those natural sounds, she detected something else, the controlled breathing of people trying to remain unnoticed. She packed her homework with deliberate casualness, making no sudden movements that might trigger premature action from whoever was positioning themselves outside. Her father had taught her that awareness without reaction often provided more information than immediate defensive postures. Better to understand the full scope of a threat before revealing that you had detected it. As she shouldered her backpack, Mrs. Coleman looked up from her desk near the circulation counter. "Heading out into the storm?" she asked with the mild concern of someone who had lived through enough Vermont winters to respect serious weather. "My ride should be here soon," Zara replied, keeping her voice steady and conversational. "I'll wait by the main entrance." Mrs. Coleman nodded and returned to her work, apparently unaware of the tension building in the corridor beyond her domain. The librarian's obliviousness confirmed what Zara had already suspected. Whatever was being planned had been carefully timed and positioned to avoid adult observation. She approached the library doors slowly, ostensibly checking the time on her phone while actually using the reflective surface of the glass to assess the hallway beyond. 3 figures stood in strategic positions near the main Entrance Connor Blake flanked by Derek Hoffman and Tyler Vance. They weren't blocking the exit directly, but their positioning made it impossible to reach the doors without passing through. Their triangle of control, a fourth figure, Jake Morrison from the wrestling team, waited near the stairwell that led to the second floor. His presence eliminated the possibility of retreat to higher levels of the building, where other adults might still be working. The positioning was professional, designed to channel her movement in a specific direction while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Zara stepped into the hallway with measured confidence, acknowledging their presence with the same polite nod she would offer any classmates encountered during normal school hours. Connor returned the gesture with a smile that held no warmth, the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment with considerable anticipation. "Heading home?" he asked, his voice carrying across the empty corridor with casual friendliness. That didn't match the tactical precision of their formation. "Waiting for my ride," she replied, continuing toward the main entrance as if their presence was purely coincidental. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed softly in the near-empty building, casting sharp shadows that made the hallway feel more institutional than usual. Connor fell into step beside her, his movement casual but clearly intended to maintain proximity. "Probably going to be a while," he observed, gesturing toward the windows where snow continued to fall with increasing intensity. "Roads are getting pretty rough. Might want to find something to do while you wait." The suggestion carried an undertone that made her previous assessment of the situation shift from possibility to certainty. This wasn't a chance encounter, it was a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to isolate her from potential assistance while maintaining the appearance of normal interaction. "I'm fine waiting here," she said, positioning herself near the main doors where arriving parents might see her through the glass if weather conditions permitted visibility. Derek moved to block her direct access to the exit, his massive frame serving as a physical barrier disguised as casual positioning. "Actually," he said with the same false friendliness that Connor had been projecting, "we were thinking you might want to see something. Kind of a school tradition for new students." Tyler nodded enthusiastically from his position near the trophy cases. "Special orientation for people who are still figuring out how things work around here. It won't take long, and it's educational." The invitation was phrased as inclusion, but Zara recognized the command structure underneath. They weren't offering her a choice, they were providing the illusion of choice while systematically eliminating her alternatives. Jake's presence near the stairwell, Derek's blocking of the main exit, Connor's proximity that could become restraint with minimal adjustment. "That's thoughtful," she replied, "but I should stay where my mother can find me when she arrives." Connor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the practiced friendliness giving way to something harder, more authentic. "Your mother called," he said, producing his phone with theatrical timing. "Roads are completely blocked. She won't be able to get here for hours. Maybe not until tomorrow morning, depending on how this storm develops." The lie was smoothly delivered, but Zara recognized it as the opening move in whatever scenario they had planned. They were establishing isolation, cutting her off from expected assistance, creating the narrative that would justify whatever followed. "I'll call her myself," she said, reaching for her own phone. Tyler laughed with amusement that sounded genuine despite the circumstances. "Good luck with that. Cell towers are already overwhelmed, and it's only going to get worse. Besides, I wouldn't want you to worry her unnecessarily. She's probably dealing with enough stress trying to navigate these roads." The psychological pressure was expertly applied, suggesting that her resistance would create problems for her mother. That cooperation was actually the more considerate choice. Connor had learned her weaknesses during the weeks of observation and was now exploiting them with surgical precision. "Come on," Derek said, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone who had played this scene before. "It's cold standing around here, and the heat's better in other parts of the building. We'll show you something interesting, get you." Warmed up, and by the time we're done, maybe the storm will have let up enough for someone to come get you. Jake pushed open the stairwell door, the sound echoing through the empty corridor with metallic finality. Beyond the doorway, Zara could see stairs leading down to the basement level where maintenance equipment, storage rooms, and the school's older infrastructure were housed. Areas that remained largely unsupervised were the building's soundproofing. Would muffle any disturbance. The destination was now clear, and with it, the full scope of what Connor had orchestrated. The social isolation campaign had been preparation for this moment, establishing her as unstable, dangerous, someone whose complaints wouldn't be believed if she survived to make them. The storm provided perfect cover, emptying the building of witnesses while creating justification for her extended absence. "I appreciate the offer," Zara said, her voice steady despite the clarity of her situation, "but I'm comfortable waiting here." Connor stepped closer, his presence now clearly intimidating rather than friendly. "That wasn't really a request," he said quietly, his true personality finally emerging from behind the careful facade he had maintained for weeks. Around them, the building settled into deeper silence as the last traces of normal school activity faded away. Outside, the storm continued to intensify, burying the world in white isolation that would hide whatever happened in the next hour from any potential observer. The trap was complete, the stage was set, and Connor Blake's expression suggested that. He had been looking forward to this moment for much longer than the few weeks she had been in Millbrook. Some predators, Zara realized, were patient enough to wait for perfect conditions before they revealed their true nature. The basement of Millbrook Regional High felt like a different world entirely. The polished hallways above gave way to concrete floors and exposed pipes, the institutional warmth replaced by industrial functionality. Fluorescent lights hung at irregular intervals, creating pools of harsh illumination, separated by patches of shadow that seemed to swallow sound. Zara descended the stairs with Connor close behind her, his presence a constant reminder that retreat was no longer an option. Derek and Tyler flanked the stairwell, while Jake brought up the rear, his wrestling-trained bulk serving as a final barrier between her and any possible escape route. Their footsteps echoed off concrete walls with metallic precision, each step carrying her further from the possibility of intervention. The basement stretched longer than she had expected, a maze of maintenance corridors and storage areas that reflected the school's age and multiple expansions. Boiler rooms hummed behind heavy doors, their mechanical breathing providing a constant background of white noise that would mask other sounds. Industrial ventilation systems created air currents that moved through the space like whispered conversations, carrying the sense of cleaning chemicals and machine oil. "This way," Connor directed, guiding her down a side corridor that led away from the main mechanical areas. His voice had lost all pretense of friendliness now, replaced by the flat authority of someone who had finally arrived at a moment he had been planning for weeks. The corridor ended at a heavy metal door marked "Maintenance Storage Authorized. Personnel Only." Jake produced a key from his pocket, the kind of access that suggested this scenario had been rehearsed, that they had scouted this location and prepared for exactly this sequence of events. The storage room beyond was larger than Zara had anticipated, filled with industrial shelving units that held everything from replacement ceiling tiles to outdated classroom furniture. Boxes of old textbooks created towering walls that divided the space into irregular sections, while abandoned projectors and computer equipment sat shrouded in dust and shadow. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh light that created sharp-edged shadows behind every piece of equipment. The air smelled like dust and disuse, the particular atmosphere of spaces that existed outside normal human activity. No cameras, no windows, no possibility of accidental discovery. Connor stepped into the center of the room and turned to face her with an expression that she finally recognized as authentic. Gone was the calculated charm, the strategic friendliness, the careful manipulation. What remained was something colder, hungrier, the predatory satisfaction of someone who had successfully isolated his prey. "You know what your problem is?" "He," said his voice carrying easily in the enclosed space. "You never learn to recognize when you're outmatched. Military brat mentality, thinking you can handle anything just because daddy taught you some tricks before he got himself killed." The reference to her father landed with deliberate cruelty, but Zara kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago not to let emotional manipulation distract from tactical assessment. 3 exits, the door they had entered through now. Blocked by Jake. A second door on the far side that probably led to another maintenance area. And what appeared to be a ventilation grate near the ceiling that was too small for human passage. Most transfer students figure out the hierarchy pretty quickly, Derek added, positioning himself between her and the far door. They understand that some people matter more than others, that some fights aren't worth having. Tyler moved to her left, completing a loose triangle that gave them tactical advantage while maintaining the appearance of conversation rather than assault. "We tried to make it easy for you. Friendly warnings, gentle guidance, opportunities to fit in. But you have to be difficult." Zara remained silent, conserving energy while calculating distances and angles. The shelving units provided potential cover, but also obstacles to movement. The abandoned furniture could be used as weapons or barriers, depending on circumstances. Her backpack, still on her shoulders, contained textbooks that could serve as improvised shields or projectiles. Connor circled closer, his movement predatory and deliberate. "Here's what's going to happen," he said with the casual authority of someone explaining the established procedure. "You're going to learn some respect. Not just for me, but for how things work in places like this. Consider it advanced education in social dynamics." He reached into his jacket and produced his phone, holding it up so she could see the camera function already activated. "We're going to document this lesson. Make sure you remember what you learned here. And if you ever think about telling stories or making complaints, well," he smiled with genuine pleasure. "Who's going to believe the unstable transfer student with anger management issues?" The recording device revealed the full sophistication of their planning. This wasn't just about physical intimidation, it was about creating permanent leverage, ensuring her silence through the threat of humiliation that could follow her beyond Millbrook. They intended to document whatever they did to her, then use that documentation to guarantee her compliance. Jake stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with theatrical menace. "Should we start with the jacket? It's pretty warm down here, and she's probably overdressed anyway." The suggestion carried implications that made Zara's tactical assessment shift from defensive to offensive. They weren't just planning to hurt her, they were planning to humiliate her, to strip away her dignity along with her clothing, while recording the process for future blackmail. "Good thinking," Connor agreed, his camera still recording. "Winter clothes are so bulky. Hard to see what's underneath all those layers." Derek reached for her jacket zipper with casual presumption, his massive hands moving with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously resisted. It was the moment Zara had been waiting for, the instant when their positioning shifted from threatening to actively aggressive, when self-defense became legally and morally justified. But instead of pulling away or protesting, she stepped closer. To Derek, inside his reaching distance, her movement so unexpected that he hesitated in confusion. In that moment of hesitation, she struck. The first technique was a simple deflection, her left hand redirecting Derek's reaching arm while her right drove upward in a sharp elbow strike to his solar plexus. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a sudden whoosh, doubling him over as he struggled to breathe. Connor shouted something, but Zara was already moving, her father's training taking over with automatic precision. Tyler lunged toward her from the left, his wrestler's instincts driving him into a grappling attempt that would have worked against someone who fought conventionally. But Krav Maga wasn't conventional. It was designed for survival, for ending threats quickly and efficiently without regard for sporting rules or gentlemanly conduct. As Tyler reached for her, she caught his wrist, stepped behind him, and used his own momentum to drive him face first into the metal shelving unit. The impact was loud enough to echo through the storage room, followed by the crash of falling boxes and equipment. Jake charged from behind, his wrestling background giving him better tactical awareness than his teammates. But his attack came from her strongest angle directly behind, where years of military training had taught her to maintain constant awareness. She spun low, her leg sweeping his feet out from under him while her elbow drove into his kidney with precision that sent him to the concrete floor in gasping pain. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 15 seconds. 3 attackers neutralized, positions reversed, the predator suddenly becoming prey. Connor stood frozen, his phone still recording, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to something approaching shock. He had expected resistance, perhaps some defensive struggles that would make their domination more satisfying. He hadn't expected to watch his backup systematically dismantled by someone he had categorized as victim rather than threat. "Turn off the camera," Zara said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Around them, Derek wheezed on the floor while Tyler tried to stop his nose from bleeding, and Jake curled in a fetal position, hands pressed to his back. Connor's finger hovered over the phone screen, but he didn't comply. His brain was still catching up to the new reality, still processing the fact that his carefully planned scenario had collapsed within moments of beginning. "Turn off the camera," she repeated, taking a step toward him. Her movement was controlled, precise, carrying the promise of consequences if he continued to refuse. Connor Blake had spent his entire life believing that consequences were things that happened to other people, that his position and connections would protect him from any serious repercussions. Even now, with his plan in ruins and his friends disabled around him, he couldn't quite accept that the balance of power had shifted so completely. Instead of compliance, he backed toward the door, still holding the phone, still recording. "You just assaulted 3 students," he said, his voice carrying a note of desperate triumph. "Unprovoked violence. I have it all on camera." Zara looked at the boys groaning on the floor, then back at Connor. "Unprovoked?" she asked quietly. "You brought me down here by force, blocked the exits, and your friend was reaching for my clothes while you recorded it. That's called attempted sexual assault, and I have every right to defend myself." The legal reality seemed to hit Connor like a physical blow. His phone wavered in his hand as he realized that his evidence of her violence was actually documentation of his own crimes. But he was too deep into the scenario to back down now, too committed to the narrative he had constructed around this moment. His expression hardened with desperate resolve as he made a decision that would transform the situation from assault to something far more dangerous. "Nobody will believe you," he said, moving toward her with sudden determination. "Your word against mine, and I'm Connor Blake. You're nobody." Some people, Zara realized as she prepared for his approach, never learned that being nobody sometimes meant having nothing left to lose. Connor Blake moved toward her with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing in real time. His carefully constructed image of dominance lay in ruins around his groaning friends, but his privileged mind couldn't accept a reality where consequences applied to him personally. The phone in his hand trembled slightly, still recording, as if documentation could somehow restore his control over the situation. "You think you've won something?" he snarled, his voice cracking with strain. "You think taking down a few guys changes anything? I own this town. My family built half of it. You're still nothing but a military brat with daddy issues and a violent streak." Zara watched his approach with the calculated calm her father had drilled into her during countless training sessions. Connor was bigger than her, stronger in raw physical terms, but he was also emotional now, angry, making the kind of mistakes that training was designed to exploit. His stance was wrong, his guard non-existent, his movement driven by rage rather than technique. "Put the phone down," she said one final time, offering him a chance to de-escalate before things became irreversible. Instead, Connor lunged forward, his free hand reaching for her throat while his phone hand swung wide in an attempt to strike her with the device. It was exactly the kind of wild, uncontrolled attack that Krav Maga practitioners trained against from day one. Someone bigger and stronger but undisciplined, relying on intimidation rather than skill. Zara stepped inside his reach, her movement fluid and precise. Her left hand caught his phone wrist, controlling the weapon while her right drove upward in a sharp strike to his throat, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to disrupt his breathing and balance. As he staggered backward, gasping, she twisted his wrist in a motion that forced his fingers to release the phone. The device clattered to the concrete floor, its screen cracking against the industrial surface. The recording stopped, the red light disappearing as the battery dislodged from impact. Connor stared at his broken phone with the expression of someone watching his insurance policy dissolve. Without the recording, without his friends as backup, without the institutional protection he had always taken for granted, he was just another teenage bully who had badly misjudged his target. "This isn't over," he wheezed, one hand pressed to his throat where her strike had landed. "My father will." "Your father?" Zara interrupted, her voice cutting through his threats with quiet authority. "Explain why his son lured a female student into an isolated basement to assault her. Why are there 4 male students down here with one girl, all of them injured except her?" Around them, Derek was finally managing to breathe normally again, though he remained doubled over against the shelving unit. Tyler sat with his back against the wall, holding tissue from his backpack against his bleeding nose. Jake had managed to roll onto his side, but showed no interest in continuing the confrontation. "You're the one who attacked us," Connor protested, but his voice lacked conviction. The legal reality was becoming clear, even to his entitled mind. 4 boys, 1 girl, isolated location, attempted recording, physical evidence of assault. The narrative he had planned to construct was becoming his own. Prosecution evidence. Zara reached into her pocket and withdrew her own phone, its screen intact and functional. "I've been recording since we left the library," she said quietly. "Everything. Your threats, your friends blocking exits, your plan to document whatever you intended to do down here." Connor's face went white as he realized the full scope of his miscalculation. He had been so focused on creating evidence against her that he hadn't considered she might be documenting his crimes in return. "The question," Zara continued, "is what happens next. Do we go upstairs and explain to whatever adults are still in the building how 4 varsity athletes ended up injured in a basement storage room? Do we involve parents, police, school administration?" The silence that followed was filled only with the building's mechanical systems and the sound of Derek's labored breathing. Tyler and Jake remained motionless, apparently hoping that immobility might somehow make them invisible. Connor stood frozen, his mind finally grappling with consequences he had never expected to face. "Or," Zara said, her voice carrying the weight of someone offering terms to defeated enemies, "we can call this a learning experience. You leave me alone, completely. No more social campaigns, no more manipulation, no more testing. You pretend I don't exist, and I'll pretend this never happened." Connor's jaw worked silently as he processed the offer. It was more generous than he deserved, and they both knew it. She was giving him a way out that preserved his reputation and avoided criminal charges, despite everything he had orchestrated. "And if I don't agree?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Zara held up her phone, its recording app still active. "Then we go upstairs, and everyone learns what Connor Blake really is when he thinks nobody's watching." The basement fell silent except for the constant hum of machinery and the subtle sounds of 3 injured boys trying to process their new understanding of cause and effect. Connor stared at her with an expression that cycled through anger, humiliation, and finally, grudging calculation. "Fine," he said eventually, the word forced through gritted teeth. "Stay away from me, and I'll stay away from you." Zara nodded once, then stopped her recording and pocketed the phone. "Help your friends," she sighed, gesturing toward the 3 boys who were slowly beginning to recover from their encounters with reality. "Make sure they understand the new arrangement." She moved toward the door, stepping carefully around Derek, who flinched away from her approach as if expecting another strike. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at Connor one final time. "One more thing," she said quietly. "If you ever threaten another student the way you threaten me, if you ever try to isolate and intimidate someone who can't defend themselves, I'll hear about it. And next time, I won't be interested in negotiating." Connor said nothing, but his expression suggested he understood both the promise and the warning contained in her words. Zara climbed the basement stairs with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the concrete stairwell like a countdown to freedom. Behind her, she could hear quiet voices as Connor began the process of helping his friends and explaining how their carefully planned assault had transformed into their own comprehensive defeat. The main floor felt different when she emerged, cleaner, brighter, filled with the kind of ordinary institutional atmosphere that belonged to places where learning happened rather than predators hunted. Through the main windows, she could see that the storm was beginning to ease, the heavy snowfall giving way to scattered flakes that danced in the wind. Rather than driving with punishing intensity, her mother's car pulled into the parking lot. 20 minutes later, headlights cutting through the winter twilight as she navigated carefully between snowdrifts that had accumulated during the storm. Zara met her at the main entrance, shouldering her backpack with the same casual efficiency she brought to any normal school day. "How was your afternoon?" her mother asked as they drove through streets that maintenance crews were already beginning to clear. "Educational," Zara replied, watching the familiar buildings of downtown Millbrook slide past in the gathering darkness. "I learned some things about how systems work here." Her mother nodded, concentrating on the treacherous road conditions. But as they drove through the quiet storm aftermath, Zara found herself thinking about equilibrium, how it could be disrupted by predators who mistook silence for weakness, and how it could be restored by those willing to demonstrate that some boundaries were not negotiable. The next Monday, Connor Blake avoided eye contact when they passed in the hallways. His friends gave her a wide berth, their body language carrying the particular caution that came from personal experience with consequences. Other students began to notice the shift, though they didn't understand its source. Sarah approached her at lunch with curious concern. "Something changed," she observed. "The social pressure just stopped. Connor's not asking questions about you anymore." Zara unwrapped her sandwich with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. "Maybe he found other things to focus on." Dr. Carver reinstated her invitation to the independent study program. Coach Torres mentioned that the advanced self-defense class was still accepting students. Mrs. Hendricks scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss how well Zara was adjusting to the school environment. By February, the isolation campaign was a memory, replaced by something approaching normal high school social dynamics. Zara remained largely invisible by choice, but it was her choice now, not something imposed by others. She had learned to navigate Millbrook's currents without being swept away by them. Some storms, she reflected, cleared the air more effectively than any amount of sunshine. And some lessons, once learned, echoed long after the original teaching moment had passed into memory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.